The dust tasted like defeat. It was a fine, gritty powder that settled on Eleanor Vance's tongue, a taste she had come to associate with the slow erasure of her world. It rose in plumes from the street where the last of her neighbors' homes had been flattened, leaving only scraped earth and the ghosts of front porches. Now only her small, stubbornly white-clapboard house remained, an island of memory in a sea of corporate ambition. The air, thick with the scent of diesel and churned soil, vibrated with the impatient rumble of the bulldozer idling at the edge of her lawn. Its massive steel blade, stained with the brick dust of other lives, glinted under the harsh morning sun. It was a dragon waiting for the order to breathe fire. Standing on her porch, her hand resting on the peeling paint of the railing her husband had built 60 years ago, Eleanor looked impossibly small. Her thin frame was wrapped in a faded cardigan, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that seemed to defy the chaos surrounding her. She did not tremble. She did not weep. She simply watched, her pale blue eyes fixed on the man standing beside a gleaming black sedan, his expensive suit a stark slash of darkness against the raw, brown landscape. Marcus Sterling, the architect of this destruction, checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. His face, usually a smooth mask of boardroom confidence, was tight with annoyance. He saw not a home but an obstacle. He saw not a woman, but a stubborn relic delaying a multi-million-dollar condominium complex he had already named the Summit. "Mrs. Vance," he called out, his voice sharp and devoid of warmth. "We've been over this. The final offer was generous. The eviction notice is legal. My crew has a schedule to keep." The foreman, a burly man with a sun-beaten face named Dave, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He avoided looking at Eleanor, focusing instead on a crack in the sidewalk. He had torn down dozens of houses, but this felt different. There was a stillness about the old woman that unnerved him, a dignity that felt heavier than the tons of steel at his command. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but clear, carrying across the small lawn without a tremor. "This house is not for sale, Mr. Sterling. It never was." Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. "It's not for sale because the city eminent domained it for this development project. It's not your house anymore, lady. It's my property. You're trespassing." He gestured impatiently at the bulldozer. "You have 5 minutes to remove your personal effects and vacate the premises before we begin demolition." A few curtains twitched in the houses across the street, the ones far enough away to be spared. Her former neighbors, now just spectators, watched the final act of their community's demise. They felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of shame, but fear was a stronger motivator. Sterling's lawyers were sharks, and no one wanted to be their next meal. Their silence was a verdict, a collective abandonment that left Eleanor utterly alone. She was a ghost on her own porch, the last guardian of a place that already felt like a memory. The dragon idled, its mechanical heart a thrumming promise of oblivion, and the world held its breath, waiting for her to break. The conflict was a study in contrasts, the roar of machinery against the quiet beat of a human heart, the cold, hard currency of a developer's ledger against the priceless currency of memory. Marcus Sterling saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. Eleanor's house was a stubborn, infuriating liability, a final entry in the wrong column that was costing him money with every passing second. He strode forward, his polished Italian shoes scuffing in the dirt, stopping just short of her wilting rose bushes. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "I have the law on my side. I have the machinery, and I have a complete lack of patience for sentimental nonsense. That house is coming down. The only variable is whether you walk out with your dignity or are carried out by the sheriff." The foreman, Dave, looked at his boots. The young operator inside the bulldozer's cab, a kid no older than 20, stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the controls. This was the part of the job they hated, the part where they had to look into the eyes of the person whose life they were about to dismantle. Eleanor did not flinch. She met Sterling's gaze, and for a moment, the sheer force of her quiet resolve seemed to push back against his aggression. "Dignity, Mr. Sterling, is not something you can grant or take away. It is something you either have or you don't. The insult, so calmly delivered, landed with precision. A flush of red crept up Sterling's neck. He was a man accustomed to deference, to people who cowered when he raised his voice. This frail old woman, with nothing left to her name but a condemned shack, was looking at him not with fear, but with something that bordered on pity. It was intolerable. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, ugly sound in the tense air. "Dave, start the engine. Let's give the lady a preview." The foreman hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Eleanor. "Sir, maybe we should wait for the sheriff to—" "Now, Dave," Sterling barked. "Or you can join Mrs. Vance in the unemployment line." Reluctantly, Dave gave a curt nod to the operator. The bulldozer's engine, which had been at a low grumble, roared to life, a deafening concussion of sound that shook the ground. It was a raw, physical display of power, designed to intimidate, to crush the spirit before it crushed the walls. The machine lurched forward a few feet, its blade lowering until it hovered just above the grass of Eleanor's lawn, a guillotine ready to fall. The noise was a physical assault, a wall of sound meant to shatter her composure. But Eleanor Vance simply stood her ground, a solitary lighthouse against a tidal wave of noise and steel, her silence a more profound defiance than any scream. This house was not just wood and nails. It was the sinew of her life, the bone structure of her memories. As the bulldozer's engine rattled the very windows her husband, Arthur, had so carefully installed, her mind retreated from the noise, seeking refuge in the quiet corridors of the past. She wasn't seeing Marcus Sterling's arrogant sneer anymore. She was seeing Arthur, young and strong, his face smudged with sawdust, his laugh echoing in the half-finished frame of the living room. He'd come back from Vietnam a different man, quieter, his eyes holding shadows she could never fully penetrate. But building this house had been his therapy, his way of constructing a future when the past was too painful to inhabit. "Every nail, Ellie," he told her, his large, calloused hand covering hers, "is a promise that we'll have a place that's ours, a place where the world can't touch us." And it had been. Within these walls, they had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. She remembered the pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, charting their son, Michael's, growth from a wobbly toddler to a lanky teenager who stooped to get through the door. Michael, who had his father's eyes and his own fierce sense of duty, had gone off to his own war and never come home. The last letter he'd sent was postmarked from Kandahar, and it rested in a small wooden box on her bedside table, beside Arthur's Purple Heart. This porch was where Arthur had taught her how to hold a hammer properly. The garden, now threatened by the bulldozer's shadow, was where he had patiently shown her how to prune roses, his gentle hands guiding hers. "You have to cut back the dead parts to let the new life grow," he'd said. A lesson she understood was not just about flowers. After Arthur passed from an illness that had its roots in the jungles of Asia, this house became more than a home. It was a sanctuary, a living testament to the two men she had loved and lost. It was her last tangible connection to them. Leaving it wasn't about losing a property. It was about betraying a promise. It was about letting the noise of men like Sterling drown out the sacred echoes of her husband's laughter and her son's footsteps. She had survived the grief that had threatened to hollow her out. She had endured the loneliness that crept in with the evening shadows. She would not be broken by a man with a checkbook and a bulldozer. Her strength was not in her frail body, but in the foundation of this house, a foundation built not on concrete, but on love and unwavering loyalty. She was not just protecting a building. She was defending a legacy. The pressure mounted, becoming a physical force. Sterling, enraged by her continued defiance, decided to escalate. He gave a sharp, downward chop of his hand, a silent command to the bulldozer operator. The message was clear: break something. Make her understand. The young operator, his face pale and slick with sweat, reluctantly engaged the hydraulics. The massive steel blade dipped, its corner digging into the soft earth of Eleanor's front lawn. It moved forward slowly, deliberately, not toward the house itself, but toward the corner of the yard where a riot of crimson roses bloomed. They were Arthur's pride and joy, the Mr. Lincoln roses he had planted their first year in the house. Eleanor had tended to them for decades, their vibrant color a defiant splash of life against the weathered white paint of the house. The sound of snapping stems and crushed petals was sickeningly clear, even over the engine's roar. The steel blade mangled the bushes, churning the dark, rich soil and burying the deep red blossoms under clumps of torn roots. It was a calculated act of cruelty, an attack not on the structure, but on the heart. A collective gasp went through the small crowd of neighbors watching from the safety of the opposite sidewalk. This was no longer about business. It was personal. It was a desecration. For the first time, Eleanor's composure wavered. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not raise her hand to wipe it away. She simply watched as 60 years of loving cultivation were destroyed in 10 seconds. The pain was sharp and visceral. A fresh grief laid atop old sorrows. It felt as if Sterling had taken a shovel to Arthur's grave. But then, something shifted within her. The pain did not break her. It forged her. The tear dried on her skin. Her spine, which had sagged for a fraction of a second, straightened again. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking back onto Sterling. The sorrow in her eyes was replaced by something harder, something ancient and unyielding. It was the look of a soldier holding the line, of a mother protecting her young. She had absorbed his best shot, his cruelest, most personal attack, and she was still standing. The destruction of the roses had been meant to shatter her will. Instead, it had galvanized it. Now, she was not just enduring. She was fighting back, with the only weapon she had left, her unbreakable spirit. The foreman, Dave, saw the look and took a half-step back. He had seen that expression before, in the eyes of men who had nothing left to lose, and he knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that this was not going to end the way Marcus Sterling thought it would. In the face of calculated cruelty, Eleanor Vance responded with an act of profound and disarming grace. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken expectation of screams, of pleas, of a final, desperate collapse. Instead, she turned, her movements slow and deliberate, and walked back to her front door. She disappeared inside for a moment, leaving a vacuum of confusion on the battlefield of her lawn. Sterling smirked, assuming she was finally gathering her things, that his power play with the roses had worked. She re-emerged moments later, holding a small, silver thermos and a single, clean ceramic mug. It was the mug Arthur had always used, a simple, weighty thing with a small chip on the rim. Ignoring Sterling completely, she descended the porch steps, her feet sure on the familiar wood. She walked across the scarred lawn, her path taking her directly toward the monstrous yellow machine that had just violated her garden. The young operator in the cab watched her approach, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. He thought she might scream at him, curse him, or even try to throw herself in front of the machine. He braced himself, his hands tightening on the levers. Eleanor stopped at the base of the bulldozer's tracks. She had to crane her neck to look up at the cab, the scale of the machine making her seem even more fragile. She unscrewed the top of the thermos, the steam of hot coffee ghosting into the cold morning air. Carefully, she poured a stream of the dark liquid into the mug. Then, she held it up. "Young man," she called, her voice steady and clear, somehow cutting through the engine's idling rumble. "You look like you need this more than I do. It's a cold morning for this kind of work." The world seemed to stop. The operator stared down at the offered cup, his mouth slightly agape. This was not in any manual. This was not a variable he could have ever predicted. He was the instrument of her home's destruction, and she was offering him coffee. It was an act of such unexpected humanity, such quiet, powerful dignity, that it shattered the cold mechanics of the situation. It was a simple gesture, yet it was a profound rebuke to Sterling's brutality. She was not seeing a monster in a machine. She was seeing a young man doing a difficult job on a cold morning. She was choosing to see his humanity, even as his employer was trying to strip her of her own. He couldn't reach for the cup. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the woman below, and in his eyes, a flicker of shame burned bright. With a trembling hand, he reached for a lever and pulled. The bulldozer's deafening roar died, replaced by a sudden, ringing silence. The operator's simple act of shutting down the engine was like a stone tossed into a still pond, its ripples spreading outward, changing the very atmosphere of the street. The abrupt silence was more powerful than the noise had ever been. In that quiet, Marcus Sterling's angry hiss was unnaturally loud. "What are you doing? Get that thing running. I'm not paying you to take a coffee break." But the young man ignored him. He just looked at Eleanor, a silent apology in his eyes. He wouldn't restart the engine. The foreman, Dave, walked over and put a hand on Sterling's arm. "Sir, I think we need to stop. This isn't right." Sterling shook him off, his face purple with rage. "I decide what's right. You work for me." But something had irrevocably shifted. The spell of fear and apathy that had held the neighborhood captive was broken. Eleanor's quiet act of grace had shamed them, but it had also inspired them. One by one, doors opened. People who had been watching from behind their curtains began to step out onto their lawns. An elderly man who had been Eleanor's neighbor for 40 years, Mr. Henderson, walked across the street and stood silently beside her. Then a young mother pushing a stroller came. Then a teenager who had once mowed Eleanor's lawn. They didn't say anything. They just came and stood, forming a small human barrier behind the old woman. Someone's phone was out, the red light of a recording blinking. The scene was no longer a private demolition. It was a public testament. The narrative had been wrested from Sterling. He was no longer the powerful developer. He was the bully, exposed and isolated in the sudden, judgmental silence. The whispers started then, quiet at first, then growing in volume. "Did you see that?" He crushed her roses. She offered him coffee. The story was being written in real time, passed from person to person. Eleanor's small, selfless action had transformed her from a victim into a hero. She had not raised her voice. She had not thrown a punch, but she had won the battle. Sterling could still legally tear down her house, but he had lost the moral high ground so completely that the victory would be hollow, a Pyrrhic victory broadcast for all to see. He stood alone in a crowd, his power evaporating in the face of a simple cup of coffee and the quiet courage it represented. Then came the sound. It began as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong in this quiet, wounded suburban street. It grew steadily, deepening from a hum to a growl, a multi-layered, guttural roar that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The ground began to tremble, not with the shudder of a single heavy machine, but with the rhythmic, synchronized pulse of 100. Heads turned, searching for the source. Marcus Sterling looked up, expecting a police helicopter, perhaps. The neighbors squinted toward the main road. The sound swelled, a rising tide of thunder that drowned out all other noise. It was the sound of rolling iron, of controlled explosions in countless cylinders, the unmistakable symphony of V-twin engines. Around the corner they came, a vision of black leather and polished chrome that seemed to blot out the sun. The first wave was a dozen Harley-Davidsons, riding in a tight, staggered formation. Behind them, another dozen and another, an endless river of steel and horsepower pouring into the small residential street. They were a legion. The afternoon light glinted off handlebars, engine blocks, and the grim, determined faces of the riders. They wore cuts, leather vests adorned with the iconic, fearsome patches of the Hells Angels. The column flowed onto the street and split with military precision, half peeling off to the left, half to the right. They methodically filled the space, parking their bikes to form an impenetrable, immovable wall. They blocked the street from curb to curb, creating a barricade of motorcycles between the bulldozers and Eleanor Vance's home. The engines were cut, one by one, the wave of sound receding until all that remained was the ticking of cooling metal and a silence more intimidating than the roar had been. 250 bikers. They sat on their silent machines, a stoic army. They were men of all ages, their faces etched with the stories of hard miles and harder lives. They did not speak. They did not threaten. They simply existed, their collective presence a massive, undeniable fact. From the center of the formation, one man dismounted. He was built like a mountain, with a long gray beard braided and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. The patch on his vest read Preacher. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that radiated authority. He walked past Sterling's gleaming sedan without a glance, his boots crunching on the dusty asphalt. He ignored the foreman, the neighbors, and the now terrified developer. His focus was entirely on the small, silver-haired woman standing on the lawn. He stopped a respectful few feet from her. He removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were surprisingly clear and intelligent. He nodded his head slowly, a gesture of profound respect. "Mrs. Vance," he rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly bass. "Preacher, Arthur used to talk about you. We heard you might be having some trouble." The revelation rippled through the crowd with the force of a shockwave. Sterling's face, already pale, turned a shade of chalky white. He had seen Eleanor Vance as a nobody, a forgotten old woman with no one to stand for her. He had not understood that the quietest people can have the loudest protectors. Preacher turned, his gaze sweeping over Sterling, the bulldozer, and the assembled crowd. He didn't need to raise his voice. Every ear was strained to catch his words. "This house," he began, his voice resonating with a deep, unshakable authority, "is not for sale, and it's not coming down. Not today. Not ever." Sterling, finding a sliver of his bravado, sputtered, "You can't. This is legal. I have the permits. Who the hell do you think you are?" Preacher's eyes narrowed, and the temperature on the street seemed to drop 10 degrees. He took a slow step toward Sterling, who instinctively recoiled. "Who are we?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "We're the people who remember." He turned back to face the neighbors, his voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the now silent street. "Most of you just see an old house. We see a monument. The man who built this house, Arthur Vance, was more than a soldier. He was one of us. He was a founding member of this charter. He was a brother." He pointed a thick finger toward the porch railing. "He built that with his own hands after his second tour in Vietnam. Said he needed to build something that would last. Something that would hold a family together." He then gestured toward the mangled rose bushes. "He planted those for his wife, Eleanor, the day they brought their son, Michael, home from the hospital. He said every beautiful thing deserved another." A younger biker, his face clean-shaven but his eyes old, stepped forward. "Arthur Vance pulled my father out of a burning Huey in the Ia Drang Valley," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He saved his life. My dad told me if I ever heard the name Vance in trouble, I was to drop everything and go. My dad's gone now, but a debt like that doesn't die with the man." Preacher nodded. Arthur was a quiet man. When his son died in Afghanistan, he didn't make a show of it. He just grieved. He and Eleanor, they grieved together in this house. This place isn't just wood. It's soaked in honor, in sacrifice, and in love. It's the home of a brother and the mother of a soldier. It's sacred ground. He finally turned his full attention back to Sterling, his gaze like a physical weight. "You're not just trying to knock down a building, you're trying to erase a legacy. You're trying to bulldoze the memory of a hero. And we, the Hell's Angels, we are the guardians of that memory. This brotherhood doesn't forget. We don't forget our own. Arthur may be gone, but his house stands. And as long as it stands, we stand with it, the truth, delivered with the force of a sledgehammer, hung in the air, transforming the rundown house into a hallowed shrine and the old woman into its revered keeper." The recognition was immediate and absolute. The arrival of the bikers and the revelation of Arthur Vance's legacy had completely rewritten the rules of engagement. The legal documents Sterling clutched in his hand were suddenly meaningless, flimsy paper against a wall of leather-clad conviction. The local police had arrived, 2 cruisers parking cautiously at the end of the street, but the officers made no move to intervene. They saw the scene for what it was. Not a riot, but a vigil. Dispersing 250 Hell's Angels who were peacefully standing guard was a situation no one wanted to inflame. Sterling, for the first time in his professional life, was utterly powerless. His money couldn't move these men. His threats were empty. His authority had vanished. He stood, exposed and diminished, as the community that had once feared him now turned their backs on him. Their attention focused on Eleanor. What happened next was a quiet, powerful transformation. The bikers didn't just stand there as intimidating statues. They began to move with purpose. A few of them walked over to the ruined rose bushes, their large, tattooed hands surprisingly gentle as they examined the damage. Another group conferred quietly, then opened the saddlebags on their bikes, pulling out tools, work gloves, and heavy-duty trash bags. They began clearing the debris from the lawn with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. This act of service broke the last vestiges of hesitation among the neighbors. Mr. Henderson disappeared into his garage and returned with a wheelbarrow and a shovel. The young mother who had stood by Eleanor went home and came back with a cooler full of bottled water, which she offered to the bikers. Soon, the street was a hive of activity. People brought rakes, lumber, hammers, and bags of potting soil. The air, which had been thick with tension and diesel fumes, now smelled of fresh-cut grass and community spirit. The bikers worked alongside the neighbors, the perceived barrier between them dissolving into a shared purpose. They were no longer the terrifying outlaws of myth. They were men, working to right a wrong, their actions speaking a language of respect that everyone understood. The most profound moment of recognition, however, came from Preacher. He watched the scene for a long moment, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Then he walked back to Eleanor, who was now sitting on her porch steps, watching the spontaneous restoration of her garden with tears in her eyes. Preacher stood before her, and with a solemnity that felt ceremonial, he shrugged out of his own cut. The leather vest was heavy, laden with patches that told the story of his life and his allegiance. The winged death head, the charter name, Patches for Fallen Brothers. It was his identity, his honor made tangible. He held it for a moment, then leaned down and gently draped it over Eleanor's small, shaking shoulders. It engulfed her, a heavy, protective mantle. "No one will ever bother you again, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a quiet vow. "You are under the protection of this club. This is our house now, too." Draping a cut over an outsider was the highest honor the club could bestow. It was a symbol of ultimate respect and unconditional belonging. Eleanor Vance, the quiet widow who had stood alone, was now sheltered by the fierce and unwavering loyalty of a brotherhood forged in steel and fire. The message was unmistakable. To touch her was to touch them all. The following days settled into a new, extraordinary rhythm. A rotating contingent of bikers maintained a constant, quiet presence on the street. They never blocked traffic or caused a disturbance. They were simply there, a silent, powerful promise. Their bikes were parked neatly along the curb, their owners sitting on the sidewalk, drinking coffee, and ensuring that no unauthorized vehicle or person came near Eleanor's property. The bulldozers had been hauled away on the first evening, Sterling's company issuing a terse press release about re-evaluating the development project pending further community outreach. The battle was over. The story, fueled by the cell phone video of Eleanor's quiet offer of coffee and the bikers' thunderous arrival, had become a local legend, then a national news item. The small house was no longer an anonymous structure but a symbol of defiance against corporate greed. Donations poured in, not that Eleanor needed them. The brotherhood and the community had already provided everything. The house itself was transformed. The bikers, many of whom were skilled tradesmen, had given it a new life. A new roof was installed. The peeling paint was scraped away and replaced with 2 fresh coats of brilliant white. The porch railing Arthur had built was sanded and varnished until it shone. The broken fence was replaced with a sturdy new one. The garden was the most remarkable change. A local nursery, having heard the story, donated 24 mature rose bushes. Bikers and neighbors worked side by side to till the soil and plant them, creating a garden even more beautiful than the one that had been destroyed. The final image of this transformation was one of quiet, profound peace. It was a week after the confrontation. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the restored street. Most of the bikers had finally departed, their promise fulfilled, leaving only a handful of the charter's leaders behind for one last cup of coffee. Eleanor sat on her porch swing, the gentle creak of its chains a familiar comfort. Preacher sat beside her, not on the swing, but on the top step, nursing a mug of her coffee. The heavy leather cut he had given her rested on the back of a nearby rocking chair, a silent guardian. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. A comfortable silence had grown between the old woman and the formidable biker, a shared understanding that transcended words. As dusk deepened, the last of the bikers stood, preparing to leave. They came to the porch one by one to shake Eleanor's hand, their grips firm but gentle, their eyes filled with a sincere, heartfelt respect. They called her Ma'am or Mrs. Vance, their deference genuine. Then it was time. Preacher stood and placed his empty mug on the railing. "We'll be checking in, Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time. Felt natural, like family. "I know you will, John," she replied, using his given name, which he had shared with her one quiet afternoon. He gave her a slow, genuine smile. Then he and the others walked to their bikes. The ritual began, the starting of the engines one after another, a staggered, rising crescendo. But the sound was different now. It was no longer a threat or an invasion. It was a chorus. It was the sound of loyalty, of a promise kept. It was a roar of honor that echoed through the peaceful twilight. The entire neighborhood was on their porches and lawns, not as fearful spectators, but as fellow guardians. They waved as the Harleys pulled away, their taillights shrinking into the distance like red embers. The thunder faded, leaving behind the gentle chirp of crickets and the scent of roses. Eleanor Vance sat on her porch, wrapped in the quiet dignity she had never lost, a queen in her small white castle, safe, respected, and finally, undeniably home.